He is working under the mentorship of James Rhodes, and James had held a teaching post at the University of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University. His research interests lie broadly in urban sociology, particularly deindustrialization, migration, territorial stigmatization, and changing forms of employment. His research is informed by debates on the relationship between race and class, racialized capitalism and racialization, and how these processes play out in smaller post-industrial towns that are not usually the focus of urban sociological analysis. So, James, yeah, you can start. You have five between 5 and 7 minutes for your speak, please.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be focused on anti-immigrant populism, and I'm going to start off by looking at some of the broader arguments that have helped me make sense of that in the context of the UK. And then I'm going to look at some of the empirical material from my own ethnographic research in a former colliery town in the East Midlands of England. So populism has focused a lot on immigration, and issues of race and migration were central to Brexit. And there was a high leave vote in many post-industrial towns. I think it's really quite important in the context of discussing populism in relation to deindustrialization to acknowledge that Brexit isn't necessarily an example of a working class revolt, driven by those left behind, but actually the leave vote cut across class divisions. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that any conditions associated with being left behind, such as economic and social disadvantage, aren't to an extent drivers of populism. But I think they're insufficient to make sense of populism on its own, not least because the conditions associated with being left behind are also shared by ethnic minorities and migrants. But that's kind of obscured by the left behind framing, which effectively works to whiten the working class. So that white prefix to working class is significant because it constitutes race as the contextualization for social position, primarily before class. So that's why Verdi and McGeever argue that some working class men and women now understand and make sense of the real economic pain they suffer through such a racialized frame of white working class victimhood. And this is indicated in quite a lot of research, and mine included, where there's a sense amongst some white working class people that minorities are given an advantage over them in relation to housing or education, jobs and welfare, despite there being little evidence to support that. So I'd argue what we're actually seeing is not a decline uniquely felt by a white working class, but is actually a decline in relative advantage over racialized others. So I found the work of Robbie Shilliam particularly instructive here, and he argues that to understand Brexit, it must be placed within the rise and fall of the white working class. So he goes into more historical detail than I can do justice to, but important to the argument is about the gains made in the post-war welfare settlement. So talking about the welfare state, social housing, secure industrial jobs. These are gains that are seen to have been left behind, but those gains weren't available to all sections of the working class because of systemic racism, and exclude and discriminated against and effectively de-skilled certain workers. So through neoliberalism, these gains are effectively rolled back, and we have a decline in status. And the victims of deindustrialization are kind of reconstructed as a welfare-dependent white underclass. So, and we know decline is really significant as a driver of politics of resentment. And it's this loss of relative advantage that Shilliam argues gives the sense of being left behind. Through populist politics, immigration and policies that aim to target racial inequalities are said to be responsible for leading to draining the resources a white working class have greater entitlement to. And this sense of loss is intensified by austerity as well. So, they've hit post-industrial towns in the UK particularly hard since the 2008 financial crisis. Okay, so if I turn to the ethnographic data, I did a year-long ethnography in Shirebrook in Derbyshire. which is a relatively small town of only about 12,000 people. And it voted significantly in favour of leave, 70.8%. It's a former colliery town, and as part of the regeneration to offset the impact of the colliery's closure, there was a sportswear retailer distribution warehouse. It's kind of typical of the low wage and insecure employment that's grown in former industrial areas in the UK. It employs about 200 permanent staff. That's an image of the warehouse there. But there's 3,000 of the employees are on temporary agency contracts. And it relies disproportionately on migrant labour, primarily from Poland, but elsewhere in Eastern Europe. So participants articulated a range of opinions about migration, from sort of indifference to pro-migration. But when anti-immigration sentiment was articulated, it was often about access to declining resources, and also about incompatible cultures, and often worked through the materiality and aesthetics of place. So through the feeling of Shirebrook being poorly resourced, or about decline, or about being run down. But these participants talked about it through the lens of immigration, and rarely was this related to austerity or structural inequalities. So, populism, we're told, is about the will of the people, and this is what legitimizes it. But there's a presumption in that opinions are unmediated, but popular and political discourse, do help shape these opinions. And Moore and Ramsey's analysis and media coverage of the referendum campaign demonstrates how stories of immigration tripled, were primarily negative, and blamed migrants for many of the UK's social and economic problems. There was evidence of this in Shirebrook. National tabloids targeted Shirebrook, and participants felt that Shirebrook was being made an example for problems with the EU and migration. Okay, so the framing of immigration as the major issue affecting Shirebrook is also done by central government and the local authority. So local governments have had budget cuts through austerity measures and have to generate more of their own income. So through the Department for Local Communities and Local Government, central government department, they have a controlling migration fund, and they invited the local authority to bid for funding. But what this means is that any social issues in Shirebrook had to be framed as resulting from the impact of immigration. So any impact that deindustrialization or austerity has is excluded. So, for example, difficulty getting a doctor's appointment becomes about the pressure on the services by immigration, and instead of under-resourcing or the effect of the town's aging population. So the point I'm trying to make is the media, as well as the state, has symbolic power to define how we see social problems, and so can reinforce negative perceptions over immigration and effectively intensify competition over entitlement to resources. And that's a potential driver of populism. Okay, thank you.
Xavier, vous êtes sur muet.
Sorry. The next one is Gilda Zazzara. Gilda is assistant professor in contemporary history at Ca' Foscari Università Venice, where she teaches labor history. Her area of specialization is Italian history after 1945, with a focus on the history of left-wing intellectuals, trade unions, workers' movements. Gilda is also engaged in non-academic activities, such as training of workers' representative for the CGIL, the largest trade union in Italy. Gilda serves as a member of the board of the Venetian Institute for the History of Resistance and Contemporary Society, and on the board for the journal Venetica. For many years, Gilda has been working on the history and memory of labor at Porto Marghera, a massive former industrial area across the Venice Lagoon. Gilda, please.
Thank you. I'm having some problem with my
sharing screen. Am I sharing now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. 1 second. Okay, here I am. Thank you very much. And good morning or afternoon, everyone. Over the last years, a broad debate is unfolding in Italy about populism, and most of the literature assumes that populism is a dysfunction or a pathology of representative democracy. I have to say that I'm not completely satisfied with these approaches because they only episodically, incidentally deal with history, with labor and class, and also because they generally look at populism with a kind of, let me say, repulsion or disgust. And I personally think that these are not good attitudes to understand the social world. However, in this presentation, I'm going to make few points with a rapid premise. There are two parties in Italy that used to define themselves populist, and I use the past tense because the pandemic is changing everything. One is the League, former Northern League, today Salvini League from its leader name, and the other is the Five Star Movement. The League Party was born in 1989 with the fusion of two local movements, one from Veneto, the region of Venice, and one from Lombardy, the region of Milan. Five Star Movement was founded in 2009, 20 years later, by the comedian Beppe Grillo, to give you an idea, sort of Italian Ricky Gervais. Roughly schematizing, the League is a right-wing populist party, not to be confused, in my opinion, with a fascist party, even though with many connections, because we have a veritable neo-fascist formation. And the League expresses an ethnic populism. Its stronger points are against immigration, fiscal pressure, universal welfare state, euro, and in favor of traditional family, Catholic roots, and you can imagine the rest of the package. Five Star Movement, at its origin and with many ambivalences, was addressing many left-oriented issues, such as environmental struggles, the basic income, birthright, citizenship for immigrants. We could say it has been a form of ethnic populism. But I'm not going to talk about the Five Star Movement at all, because it's going through radical changes, and its consent that was formidable just a few years ago is turning out extremely volatile. On the contrary, the League is a very solid party. Nowadays, it's the oldest party of the Italian Republic. And the League is now pursuing a nationalistic discourse, Italians first, but it remains anchored to the north, the more developed, the more industrialized part of the country. Just a rough figure, 30% of the vote in Veneto and Lombardy, 5% in Sicily or in the region of Naples at the last general elections in 2018. We know that the core of this consent is amongst the less educated, the lower middle class, and the industrial working class. But which working class? This is the point I would make. The working class of what we call the widespread industrialization model, the working class of the small and medium businesses, people living and working in small towns, in what has been described as an industrialized countryside. This model has been studied in the 1980s by two MIT scholars, Pyer and Sable, in a book that was very influential in Italy, where they described successful industrial alternatives to Fordism, paying much attention to the Italian case. It's important to think about the specific labor culture of this working class, a culture based on the cult of hard work, manual work. The historical leader of the Northern League used to showing himself wearing sleeveless undershirts, which is the supreme pop symbol of manual labor in Italy. A world of labor with low rates of union membership, where a thin cultural line divided employees and employers, and where bargaining was, and still is, often individual and informal. I want to emphasize this. If we look at history, not at theory, the Leaguist populism emerged as an industrial political phenomenon, local and popular, able to hook a peripheral but emerging labor culture, and it's still adherent to it. And this culture was built in clear opposition to the other working class culture, the one of big, urban, often state-led industry, where politicization and mobilization were high. And the moment the League took hold in the North was the 80s and the 90s, when the big industries of the industrial triangle were under restructuring, downsizing, and finally shut down with large state subsidies and union bargaining. That other working class, the deindustrializing working class, has resisted much longer to the siren of populism, at least if we look at voting behaviors. At the polling stations, in its majority, this working class remained loyal, faithful to the left, also while passing through early retirements, job losses, work-related diseases. Even at the time when it was declining, it was taking its leave from history. It is only in the last 10 to 15 years that the League has begun to conquer the strongholds of former 40s North. And the final moment was in 2020, when the League resulted the first party in Sesto San Giovanni, which today means periphery of Milan, but once was the more industrialized, unionized, and leftist municipality of Italy. And today is the symbol of the accomplished Italian deindustrialization. How could we frame the link between deindustrialization and populism? I would say, but it's just a presumption, as this topic has not been studied as such, that it is after deindustrialization that right-wing populism could break through in places like Sesto, when that working class was defeated and turned out to be residual. But it has been through deindustrialization, even if not elaborated yet, that places like Sesto have become cheated communities where the son and grandchildren of the deindustrialized working class have discovered that no decent alternative futures had replaced the factories. And at the same time, they have cut identity and memory ties with that past. So I conclude only by saying that there is much work to be done, qualitative historical work in dialogue, but broadening the perspectives of the theoretical political literature I've mentioned at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gilda. Really interesting. So the next one is Marion Fontaine. Marion will speak in French, but you can see translation in closed captation. Donc Marion Fontaine, pardon, est maîtresse de conférences habilitée en histoire contemporaine à l'Université d'Avignon, directrice du laboratoire Norbert Elias. Marion est une éminente spécialiste des mondes miniers en France, de l'identité ouvrière à travers le football. Sa thèse a été consacrée au Racing Club de Lens et au Gueule Noire. Elle a publié un livre sur la catastrophe de Liévin en 1974 qui s'appelle « La fin d'un monde ouvrier ». Et elle vient de soutenir une habilitation remarquée il y a quelques semaines sur les mondes miniers en France de la Libération à nos jours. Marion, c'est à toi.
Merci Xavier. Hello everyone, and if I can, I'm going to switch to French. So, je voudrais analyser cette question du populisme pour le cas de l'ancien bassin industriel du nord de la France, d'abord sous l'angle d'un changement, en réalité d'une rupture très profonde en matière d'image et de représentation. Donc, longtemps, en effet, ce nord industriel, ce nord de la France, a été considéré comme une terre d'élection, un bastion pour le mouvement ouvrier et les partis de gauche. Le pays noir, the Black Country, était le lieu où se construisait la modernité et l'avenir. Et les ouvriers, les mineurs, les sidérurgistes étaient les héros de cet avenir les premiers représentants d'une classe ouvrière unifiée et mobilisée. Je vous ai mis ici l'une des citations d'un écrivain communiste, André Steele, qui dit bien cette idée qu'à ce moment-là, le Nord et les mineurs représentent l'avenir de la gauche et de la France. À partir des années 60-70, cependant, cette image, ce mythe, se sont radicalement modifiés. Comme l'a montré Stephen Hague à propos de la Rust Belt, cette image du Nord s'est d'abord transformée du point de vue social et économique. L'ancien bassin du Nord a été de plus en plus représenté comme un territoire archaïque, en retard, left behind, une sorte de repoussoir, d'antithèse à la modernité post-industrielle et numérique. Il est dépeint aujourd'hui encore comme un concentré des problèmes laissés derrière elle par la désindustrialisation, problèmes environnementaux, déstructuration des villes, crise de l'emploi, exclusion, dégradation des indicateurs sanitaires et sociaux. Plus récemment, cependant, ça n'apparaît pas avant le début des années 2000, l'image du Nord s'est aussi transformée du point de vue politique. Depuis les élections présidentielles de 2002, surtout, qui ont vu pour la première fois l'extrême droite de Jean-Marie Le Pen arriver au deuxième tour, le bassin du Nord est dépeint comme l'un des points de cristallisation du populisme d'extrême droite. Je pense qu'il faut bien mesurer le changement que ça implique. L'ancienne terre héroïque du prolétariat semble désormais incarner une menace ou une inquiétude pour la démocratie. Les descendants des combattants de la classe ouvrière sont considérés au mieux comme des idiots manipulés, au pire comme des fourriers du fascisme. Même la gauche, et je pense qu'il faut aussi parler des partis de gauche, des anciens partis ouvriers dans cette histoire, même la gauche française en réalité n'échappe pas à cette perception et observe avec beaucoup de gêne et de malaise, sans savoir très bien quoi en faire, ces électeurs qui se sont détournés d'elle. Alors, une telle interprétation revient à faire du bassin nordiste et en général des régions désindustrialisées, le berceau du populisme d'extrême droite. Cette interprétation n'est bien sûr pas entièrement fausse, mais je voudrais ici insister sur le fait que cette représentation qui fait de nouveau du Nord un bastion, mais cette fois un bastion du populisme, martelée par les médias et par les observateurs, c'est une espèce de constante dans le discours politique français, fonctionne aussi comme un piège, notamment, et je rejoindrai tout à fait ce que vient de dire Gilda Zazzara sur les différents points, parce qu'elle repose sur une lecture très simplificatrice à la fois du passé industriel et du présent post-industriel, ou quel que soit le nom qu'on lui donne. Pour commencer, l'interprétation qui prévaut aujourd'hui idéalise considérablement le passé par rapport au présent. Elle revient en fait à dire que c'était mieux avant, qu'il y a eu un temps idéal où les ouvriers auraient été unis, politisés, solidaires, de gauche, et où tout aurait été pour le mieux dans le meilleur des mondes possible. Alors, je pense qu'il faut être bien attentif au fait que nombre de questions qui nous apparaissent comme nouvelles aujourd'hui et qui sont liées au populisme, le rapport à l'autorité, à la nation, l'existence d'un vote ouvrier conservateur, la fracturation des classes populaires selon des lignes de partage religieuses, culturelles ou en termes d'origine migratoire, toutes ces questions sont en réalité présentes dès la fin du XIXe siècle. On sait qu'il y a eu des rixes importantes entre ouvriers mineurs belges et français, par exemple, à la fin du XIXe siècle. Pour prendre un autre exemple, les ouvriers polonais qui furent très marqués par le catholicisme ont longtemps été mis à l'écart, justement en raison de leur catholicisme, donc en raison de leur identité religieuse. Et on peut souligner de manière générale que l'organisation du travail industriel, loin d'unifier le groupe ouvrier, a pu accroître les divisions, par exemple entre les ouvriers locaux disposant d'emplois relativement stables et les ouvriers migrants, par exemple les ouvriers marocains que vous voyez ici, invisibles et astreints à des contrats précaires. Ce qui est intéressant aussi de noter, c'est que l'identité de gauche s'est construite parfois en essayant de dépasser ces divisions et ces formes de fractures, mais quelquefois aussi en les acceptant implicitement. Et je pense aussi que cet héritage d'invisibilisation de la gauche est aussi à questionner. Le deuxième problème que me pose cette interprétation du Nord comme bastion du populisme concerne l'interprétation du présent. Ça me semble en fait constituer un cercle vicieux. puisque l'interprétation qui prévaut contribue, je pense, à nourrir le sentiment d'exclusion des habitants du bassin, présenté systématiquement, il y a quelqu'un d'autre ici dans cette salle qui peut en témoigner, présenté par les médias nationaux comme des beaufs, comme des fachos, comme des petits blancs. C'est très difficilement traduisible en anglais, mais on dirait des chaffs, des white trash, et que par réaction à cette stigmatisation, je pense que le vote populiste ne fait en fait que s'amplifier. Le deuxième problème, me semble-t-il, qui apparaît, c'est qu'on impute ici aux anciennes terres industrielles, au nord ou à la Lorraine, des problèmes, le racisme, le populisme, qui en réalité, si on se regarde bien, se retrouvent dans bien d'autres endroits du pays qui n'ont pas du tout cet héritage industriel. Le populisme d'extrême droite est par exemple très présent dans le sud de la France, où on ne retrouve pas du tout cet héritage industriel. Donc tout ça pour dire que les images et les mythes du populisme liés aux anciens bassins industriels, je pense, constituent non pas une explication du problème actuel, mais une part du problème, et constituent un vrai défi pour les sciences sociales. Donc je serais tout à fait d'accord avec Gilda Zazzara pour dire que le principal travail qu'il y a à mener est un travail d'explicitation et d'élucidation. Il faudrait d'abord mieux distinguer ce qui, dans le vote populiste, relève effectivement d'héritage industriel ancien, de gestion manquée de la désindustrialisation, mais aussi de causalité beaucoup plus générales et beaucoup plus récentes qui n'ont pas forcément de rapport direct avec la désindustrialisation, le rapport à la mondialisation, les transformations d'État-providence, enfin, il peut y avoir des tas de raisons. À partir de là, me semble-t-il, et c'est seulement en examinant ces causalités générales que l'on pourrait mieux comprendre comment et pourquoi un bassin comme celui du Nord abrite effectivement, c'est indéniable, des formes de segmentation et de tension qui nourrissent l'exclusion, même si ce n'est pas forcément celle auquel on peut s'attendre. Mais on verrait aussi que les habitants de ces bassins industriels expriment des attentes, des demandes de renouvellement dans le rapport à l'État, dans la volonté d'égalité, dans l'organisation de la vie collective, qui vont dans le sens de l'inclusion. Et l'autre question que l'on peut poser en sens inverse, plutôt que de se demander pourquoi le populisme est aussi présent dans ces régions, c'est de se demander en sens inverse pourquoi les partis de gauche, anciens, présents ou à venir, sont aussi peu présents. Tout ça pour dire qu'il s'agirait en somme de sortir ces anciens bassins industriels, je pense, de la prison des représentations idéalisées pour le passé ou diabolisées pour le présent, pour prendre au sérieux le réel qu'ils manifestent, qu'ils ont manifesté et qu'ils manifestent dans toute sa complexité. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup Marion. Merci beaucoup. The next one speaker is Stefan Moitra. Stefan is a researcher at Deutsches Bergbau-Museum in Bochum, in Germany. From 2006 to 2008, he was a Marie Curie Fellow at the Center for European Studies at University College London, where he also did his PhD on working class culture and cinema in Germany and Britain after 1945. Now he's working on the social history of mining communities in Germany, the history of scientific knowledge and education in the coal industry, as well as on visual representation for mine work. More recently, he has co-conducted an oral history project on life stories and memories of West German coal mining. He is also a co-coordinator for the working group Memory and Deindustrialization in the European Labour History Network. So please, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Now I want to start with saying that actually I haven't really myself so far worked in the field of populism and its potential interrelations with deindustrialization. So in this respect, what I'm going to present has to be understood as first provisional ideas on my part as to how today's increasingly polarized political and social climate can be conceptualized with regard to the post-industrial situation. I will be looking at the Ruhr Valley in particular in my presentation. However, I think like the other speakers, you can't really separate the observations from one locality from the national context or even international context. So anyway, these will rather be several loose ends, and we'll see if I can tie them all together in 7 minutes. In any case, I hope this will give some input to our discussion. So first of all, what's addressed as populism in the German context today, first and foremost, refers to populism from the right, and especially the presence of the so-called Alternative für Deutschland party, the AfD, since 2013, which functions as a shelter for the political right of all shades, from ultra-conservatives who don't feel home any longer in Angela Merkel's CDU to outright neo-fascists. And one has to concede that they, the AfD, have been very successful in two respects. Firstly, in driving the political discourse of all parties to the right, to a certain extent at least. And secondly, in being a catalyst for a cluster of right-wing groups and organizations which are not necessarily directly aligned with the party, to form what might be called a veritable social movement in some parts, a right-wing social movement, with the AfD as a parliamentary arm. So my illustration here is just from today's Guardian website, actually a screenshot where they talk about actually the even terrorist tendencies of this right-wing social cluster and social movements, of which the AfD is sort of the screen organization that you see in front. But in which ways does the AfD's populism relate to the context of deindustrialization? As in many other national contexts, it has been assumed that it's particularly the so-called left behinds in the deindustrialized regions which are prone to nationalist and xenophobe ideas. And if we look at the Ruhr, the AfD is indeed referring to the old imagery and language of industry and working class culture. And a particular case in point is what you see here, a man called Guido Reil, who used to be a coal miner, active social democrat and shop steward, but joined the AfD in 2016 in opposition to the government's migration politics, which the SPD was a vital part of. And as you can see, even in election ads, which I have illustrated here, he styles himself in mining gear and with coal dust smeared in his face, so as to be understood as being, you know, one of us, a guy from the streets, and claiming to represent the very social values which the Social Democrats have already left behind. So there is a clear addressing of old values deriving from an old moral economy, to come back to last session's topic, and the distinction between an us and them. Here, the deprived post-industrial and explicitly German working class, and there, on the other side, a political elite represented by the former Workers' Party, SPD, who have long lost touch with the people and are made responsible for more migration into already precarious urban environments. So there's a sort of xenophobic double bind of othering at play here, which is, I think, an important factor in the creation of the populist right-wing mode. The enemy is created in the juxtaposition of both Germans versus perceived foreigners and the old working class versus the elites. So there's a crucial mechanism in right-wing thinking, even going back to thinkers like Carl Schmitt in the 1920s and 30s, for whom having the enemy was key to political action in general. You know, having an enemy was the crucial driving of political thinking and action. And I think you can draw a kind of continuity of ideas there. Particularly with regard to East Germany, where the AfD has successes of up to 25% of votes in elections, sociologists like Klaus Dörre have observed that this kind of thinking has not just entered working class communities, but is also prevalent in actors who are active in the trade unions and works councils. And even the sociologists even ask whether this leads to a labor movement from the right. So it's a bit of a polemical question there. Without digging further into this now, I want to add that there hasn't been much of a comparison so far between deindustrialization and East and West Germany, particularly the Ruhr region. These were obviously two very different kinds of transformations, but it would be interesting to ask for the differences in handling the social crisis of industrial closure in both cases. And of course, this also hints at the question of transformation in 1989-90 and the 90s in general as triggering rough industrial decline in East and Central Europe in general. And just coming back to what Marion said in her presentation, when she was saying that the deindustrialized regions were kind of chosen lands for the right-wing populists, I think the former GDR, Eastern Germany, was actually the first region where the right parties or the right movements explicitly went to first. And it has actually only been recently that something similar is happening in the Ruhr. I think this is quite interesting. There's a kind of exchange between the regions, East and West, in terms of these transformations and right-wing actions. Now, these glimpses into the current situation, these are glimpses into the current situation. From a historical point of view, I think we have to ask further as to the roots and precursors of these ideological settings and practices in order to better understand what is happening now. This includes the neoliberal turn of social democracy in the late 90s and early 2000s under Gerhard Schröder, which might itself be described as a populist endeavor, with all its discourse about the unwillingness of the unemployed to work and the pressuring of people out of jobs to take low-paid jobs, and actually creating, I think, the biggest low-paid sector in Europe, which is in Germany today. And this has its roots. So the precarization of workers today has its roots actually in these kinds of social democratic actions of the 90s and 2000s. I think this is something similar that you can relate to New Labour in the UK. And this historical perspective could also ask, for instance, for the very local history of neo-fascist violence against migrant populations already in the earlier stages of industrial crisis. A history that has not been written yet, as far as I can see, which would also have to include the history of anti-fascist initiatives, very often trade unionists and works councils, and the self-organization of migrants themselves to make themselves heard in the public sphere. And this connects to my last point before I come to an end, coming back into the present, the othering of migrants, particularly in the old industrial regions, which is a strong discourse, not just in the AfD, but all parties. This othering, at least to some extent, is based on the perception of migrant workers and their family as being foreigners, strangers, people who are from a different kind of culture and cultural background. However, today it's the children and even grandchildren of the migrant workers, many of whom are now less and less marginalized and have a good education and visibly enter public positions. Yet this implies also struggles over narratives and histories hardly acknowledged as being part of the German self-image so far. For instance, a whole new generation of journalists with migrant roots regularly face the vilest reactions in social media and the wider public sphere. Something which the sociologist Aladdin El-Mafalani, which I have here as an illustration, calls the integration paradox. So roughly speaking, visibility of migrants leads to aggression. So in some ways, the nightmare of the xenophobes has already come true. Those who used to be marginalized and excluded yesterday because of ethnicity and class have now become important voices already in the public sphere and make themselves heard, which among other factors triggers the populist backlash. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It was very interesting. So our fifth speaker is Sean O'Connell. Sean is a professor of modern Irish and British social history. He's a founder of Quote Hub, Queen's University Collective of Oral Historians, and editor of the journal Oral History. His past work has examined the history of working class experience of consumer credit and debt. He is currently completing a monograph for paragraph pivot on the history of joyriding, which include an analysis of deindustrialization and young offenders. Most recently, Sean completed a research report commissioned by the Department of Health of Northern Ireland, examining the history of mother and baby homes at Magdalen Laundries in Northern Ireland, with Lynn McCormick. Shep's upcoming project explores deindustrialization in Northern Ireland that will first explore in this article the trouble with the local case. Sean, please.
Thanks very much, and hello everyone. I think Lauren is going to take control of my PowerPoint for me due to my general incompetence, so apologies for that. I'm going to begin by also saying, like Stefan, I'm not a specialist on populism, so for my inspiration for my magnificent 7 minutes is to look back at the notes of a meeting that took place in Kent a couple of years ago, where a number of the key figures in this collective were discussing populism. So as I say, I took my inspiration from some of the questions and the challenges that they raised that day. So amongst those, they talked about the linkages between deindustrialization and the populist far right. And there were questions and debate about whether that linkage was being pushed too far in terms of the direction of the project at its outset. So there was an agreement on navigating different narratives, not accepting too simplistically some of these bigger narratives, and an agreement that the aim should be to reveal the various aspects of this, what was called connective tissue, interrogate the rhetoric linking deindustrialization and populism, and that there was a need to address populism but still complicate the narrative. It can't just be about solving right-wing populism. It's a transversal access right now. Think about left-wing populism as well as right-wing populism. So context matters, as does comparative frameworks. It was also suggested we need to ask questions in each local setting, such as about industrial heritage, how labour is different in different settings, how different political traditions are impactful. And it was also suggested that we perhaps need to broaden what we mean by the politics of our time. Okay, so today I want to address some of these points using Northern Ireland as a case study. And I wonder how it might compare with other regions where fissures between workers on ethno-sectarian or racial divides were significant. We've heard a little bit about this already in the earlier papers. So I want to perhaps raise questions such as, what is the role of nationalism in populism when there are two forms of nationalism at play? In Northern Ireland, we have Irish nationalism. We also have Ulster Unionism, itself very much linked to the populist form of Britishness, which is associated recently with Brexit. So can we go to slide 2, please, Lauren? Okay, so just starting with a few images for you, just to warm you up in terms of Northern Ireland and Belfast in particular. An iconic image of two arguably failed Belfast projects, the Titanic and the DeLorean car. Do you want to go to the next one, Lauren? Here's a message for you all from North Belfast, from Loyalist North Belfast. I'd be interested to see or to hear what you think of the messaging that's going on there. You know, it's a complex message that I'm trying to work out myself as I cycle past that every day to work. Next image, please, Lauren. And we had Trump to start with, so we might as well have Boris Johnson as well. This is Boris Johnson with the Boris bus, which is made or was made by Wrightbus in Ballymena. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ballymena in a minute. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's Unite the Union campaigning against recent job losses in Ballymena. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is in terms of timeline and the politics of our time, and what I want to talk about here is a little bit about, you know, where do we begin, where do we start? And in terms of Northern Ireland, where does this particular story of populism and deindustrialization start? I think a quick history of Northern Ireland would involve having to understand the extent to which there was a very sectarianized workforce, you know, including infamous incidents such as expulsions of Catholic and what were called bad prod workers, i.e. Protestants who were members of the trade unions or socialists in 1920 from Harland and Wolff, which has coloured the way in which Harland and Wolff is seen by the nationalist community in Northern Ireland ever since. And statements by the Protestant unionist leader, Prime Minister of Northern Ireland in the 1930s about how Protestant employers should look after Protestant workers during the economic downturn of the 1930s. After the Second World War, there was a process of decline, an early phase of deindustrialization. Some of the highlights or lowlights, we should call them, appear on that slide. And individuals began to appear at that point to exploit that, both from the left and from the right. So the Northern Ireland Labour Party were able to exploit rising unemployment in the 1960s, late 50s and 1960s. Northern Ireland had levels of unemployment at 6% when the rest of the UK was about 1.5%. So it never really had full employment. It always had issues around deindustrialization and job loss and unemployment. And that was most famously exploited by Ian Paisley, who in the 1960s emerged on the scene, a bit like an early prototype of Trump, in that he liked to wave a Bible around and that he was very charismatic and liked to appear on television a lot. And he began to use very much the shipyards and shipyard job losses as a whip to crack against the elite, whether that elite was the Ulster Unionist elite or whether it was the elite in the British Parliament, or later it was a European elite. He was very much anti-European from the 1970s onwards. And he formed his Democratic Unionist Party in 1971. As we go through the 70s, obviously the troubles arrives in Northern Ireland. Deindustrialisation continues, it worsens. 40,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in Belfast alone between the 70s and the 80s. But as Peter Hodson's explained in his recent Queen's PhD, Harland and Wolff in some respects was cocooned from that. Ironically, Margaret Thatcher pumped quite a lot of cash into Harland and Wolff in order to prevent high levels of Protestant unemployment becoming even greater in East Belfast. Despite that, the DUP were working away, building a populist campaign and took the seat in East Belfast in 1979. So I want to go to the next slide, Lauren. Okay, so this is Anderson and Shuttleworth, as you can see, in the context of Northern Ireland, nothing is seen as ordinary, and that includes deindustrialization. It's always seen through a sectarian lens, and this is why I wonder how populism works here in this respect. For example, I know from personal experience that I've heard many from the nationalist community who certainly haven't shed any tears when they've heard about job losses at Harland and Wolff, because Harland and Wolff has this reputation as being a hardline loyalist, hardline unionist, and also the place from where Catholics were expelled and not given employment later on. So that certainly adds a particularly nasty element to the story of deindustrialization in Northern Ireland. Can we jump to the next slide, please? Okay, so I want to take the story in the last minute or two to Ballymena, which is a town about 20 miles north of Belfast, and it's a town that's experienced deindustrialization harshly in the last 10 years or so. It also happens to be the home of Ian Paisley Jr., who is the son of the founder of the Democratic Unionist Party. We saw him in the opening slide with Trump. And in 2015, both Gallagher's, the tobacco factory, and Michelin's tyre factory announced their imminent closure. 860 jobs went at Gallagher's, and an approximately similar number were to go at the Michelin tyre factory. As you can see there, Paisley's response to the MP, response to the Gallagher's closure, was to berate European directives and health fanatics in the European lobby, and to berate also the British government, which at that point was the David Cameron Conservative government, for not standing up for Europe. Sorry, standing up against Europe. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Oh, sorry, this should have been at the start. This is Paisley with the Trumps. So 2 political dynasties, as I say there, hopefully not. So what am I saying in conclusion here? I don't have a conventional conclusion, I think. Instead, I want to throw out some questions about conducting an oral history project in Ballymena, looking at those workers and their families who've experienced those recent job losses, because they coincided so neatly with Brexit, really. And this is something that perhaps Pete Hodson, who's here today, might carry out if funding allows. Hopefully it will do. So I can think of some immediate questions based on today's theme, populism, and also several other themes that related to the overall project. Certainly, I think oral history is our best tool to analyse this issue of populism. In Northern Ireland, it was very difficult to try and trace it through shifting electoral fortunes of the Ulster Unionist Party versus the Democratic Unionist Party, or the SDLP versus Sinn Féin, who are the more populist party on the nationalist side. And it'd be very difficult to unravel deindustrialization in looking at all of that. So I'm beginning to think about what kind of questions would be asked in interview, and what people here today think will be those questions. How do we detect populist influences in working class narratives on job losses in Ballymena or in any other area? Are we to look for citations of Paisley? Are we to look for denouncements of the European Union? Are we to ask them who they follow on Twitter? Or should we ask for access to their Facebook pages so that we can look back at what they were reading and what they were themselves writing on Facebook in the years prior to 2016? Or are we to ask them what are their earliest political memories? And this all, I think, links back to this question of what does the politics of our time mean in this context? How far are we looking back in terms of our time? And I wonder too about the tone of Paisley's lament in that statement. It was of someone who'd accepted defeat. And I wonder whether the many females in the workforce shaped his rhetoric and his attitude there. Was he deploying this moment of deindustrialization also as a chip to play in the following year's Brexit referendum, hence all those quotes about Polish workers and the European Union? And this leads us to the fact that Ballymena presents a potential case study around gender. What will be revealed about looking at gender in terms of the memory of populism? Will there be any differences there? What do people anticipate about that? How might we get the answers to that? And more broadly, how does the Ballymena female workers' experience compare with France, Canada, USA, Germany, etc.? And I also think finally then that Ballymena offers a study that in some ways fits the elements of the broader project. In terms of Northern Ireland, it was a relatively affluent town in the late 20th and early 21st century, before deindustrialization came along more recently. And as such, it can be compared with Belfast's earlier experiences and provide a local comparator with our broader overarching transnational studies. In making that local comparison, what would be different in the attitudes revealed by the Ballymena worker laid off in 2015 compared with the Belfast worker made redundant in the 1980s or 1990s, I wonder? And what will they reveal about the politics of our time? Okay, I'll finish there. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Shan. Thank you. Now we cross the ocean for our last speaker, Greg Wilson, Greg Wilson is professor of history at the University of Akron, where he teaches courses in United States, Ohio, and public history. In both teaching and research, he has utilized oral history and community history. His published work includes Above the Shot, an oral history of the Kent State shooting with Craig Simpson, Ohio, an history of the Buckeye State with Kevin Kern, and Community Left Behind, the Area Redevelopment Administration. He is currently finishing a book about keep-on contamination among workers and the environment in Virginia. Please, Craig.
Okay, merci, thank you. Everybody can see the screen okay, right? Okay, good. Well, yeah, we're jumping across the pond, as they say. So let me focus on a few ideas. As Stefan and others have said, this is not my area of expertise, but some things I've noticed. I want to share a few points today to add to the conversation. So let me see if I can do that. I don't know if this is sharing okay or not. Is it? There it goes. Okay. So first, from what I've been hearing and what I've been reading, we don't have a consistent definition of populism. It remains elusive. Second, if we're looking at the US context, one of the big issues that scholars have been using and our studies are shaped by is the history of the People's Party or the populist movement from the late 19th century. And the views of that movement have changed over time, often in response to contemporary concerns. And then third is the very recent interest in populism that is related to the rise of rightist political movements in the US and Europe, of course, and the role of deindustrialization in those. So let me begin with a definition that I have been finding more persuasive than others. This is one by Cas Muda, who's a political scientist, where he notes that populism is a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous but antagonistic groups, the people, pure people, and the corrupt elite. And that populism argues that the politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. So Muda notes that other definitions are focusing solely mainly on leadership, what he calls the supply side, and leave out what we might call the demand side, the social groups. Muda also notes that populism can be from the left or the right, and that it can be organized, whether it's top down or we might say in a bottom up fashion as well. So now turning a little bit to populism in the US, one of the key issues that historians have looked back to now is the populist movement of the 19th century. Historians have largely seen this movement as a positive one, although lately with the rise of Donald Trump and white nationalism, now some are rethinking this. There's a growing re-examination of this movement back to a more critical view forged first by Richard Hofstadter and sociologists in the 1950s and 60s. Now, Hofstadter held an empathetic yet also critical view of populism. In general, his populists were driven to irrationality and paranoia, anxiety over their loss of status, particularly from rural areas where the urban world was taking over. Their values were being supplanted. They were anti-modern also in Hofstadter's view, also often anti-Semitic as well. Hofstadter, writing in this era, had in mind the recent episodes of the Nazi regime and also the Red Scare, fueled by Joseph McCarthy and anti-communism in the United States. Now, scholars shifted their view in the 1960s, particularly after the social movements of that era, to a more positive view that's been mainly the dominant one that we've seen until very recently. Lawrence Goodwin's work, for example, looked at populism as challenging the creed of progress. It was a self-generated culture of collective dignity, individual longing. He saw populism of the 19th century as akin to the movements of the 60s and early 70s of the social movements that he was involved in. Another major contributor has been Michael Kazin's work. He saw populism of the 19th century as the first wave of patriotic Americanism, challenging the elites and the status quo, holding the feet of feckless centrist liberals to the fire of economic egalitarianism. Now, this view, when he first wrote in the 90s, worked well in the age of neoliberalism and the presidency of Bill Clinton. And lastly, another major work that's come out, Charles Postel's work on the populist vision. He saw populists as well-connected, modern, that favored progress, but instead wanted to preserve their own form of localism and solidarity, a sustainable economic association in the face of globalized financial capitalism. His populists were also not just rural, but also middle class, and not just agrarians. Okay. So the views of populism now have turned to a more negative view after all of these positive connotations that have been developed. And using that 19th century movement as a touchstone, though, I think should be done cautiously. Hofstadter may have been wrong about populism per se, but his focus on seeing populism as a phenomenon of style is worth remembering. He also helps us see that cultural as well as economic grievances are important. And this, of course, reflects a turn in deindustrialization studies that have turned to culture, but not leaving behind the policy or the economic issues. So I think we need to be mindful also that populism has, as we've already heard today, positive connotations, but also negative ones as well. Now, thinking about deindustrialization a little more specifically, a few points to mention here. Sherry Lincoln and John Russo have recently written of the long memory of those in Youngstown, Ohio, and elsewhere who've heard the promises of policies to address economic restructuring, only to see those promises fade away. Residents' support for Trump stem from a long history of resentments against an economy that isn't working for them and against elites who supported it. For many, they write, these resentments have also fueled racist and anti-immigrant positions. Others have begun looking at the prospects of quantifying the connection between deindustrialization communities and the populist anti-globalization rhetoric and policies of Trump and others, examining, for example, voting patterns, as we've heard today as well. Margalit notes, though, that there needs to be a mutuality between cultural issues and material concerns. To quote him here, consequently, when populist politicians address issues such as immigration, trade, rural-urban disparities, they tap into public disaffection that goes beyond voters' concerns with the material impact of those issues. Niles Gilman makes the same point in his essay that connects Hofstadter's work to today's populism, when he says that for many people, political choices are less about policy specifics than about expression and identity. So along with these cultural issues, we should bear in mind the recent efforts to connect Trump to working class voters in the most recent elections here in the United States. Michael Zweig reminds us that the fixation on, quote, white working class, end quote, often is seen as male. And we lose track of the fact that the role of minorities and women have played in the working class for many, many generations. We lose, as I would think, intersectionality. So perhaps it was all too easy for this white working class, in quotes, both men and women, to overlook the racism and the misogyny of Trump and others. But our work, I think, should recognize how Black and Latino or Latinx voters certainly did not overlook those issues. So to sum up very quickly here, it's at this historical moment where our project has landed. We have to consider deindustrialized communities and the people who live there We should keep in mind Muda's point that populism is thin. It's also malleable. It's complicated. Those populists of the left could very soon become the populists of the right, changing back and forth. There are genuine concerns about plutocracy and democracy, but populism also reminds us to deconstruct the smokestack nostalgia in memory and identity. And it reminds us to face some hard truths about racism, nativism, sexism, and also homophobia as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Yes, it's a really, really very interesting roundtable. I think some colleagues have a lot of questions. I don't know who wants to start. Stefan, you are the first one.